Now, it is no secret that the president-elect and I have some pretty significant differences. But remember, 8 years ago, President Bush and I had some pretty significant differences. But President Bush's team could not have been more professional or more gracious in making sure we had a smooth transition so that we could hit the ground running. And one thing you realize quickly in this job is that the presidency and the vice presidency is bigger than any of us. So I have instructed my team to follow the example that President Bush's team set 8 years ago and work as hard as we can to make sure that this is a successful transition for the president-elect. Because we are now all rooting for his success in uniting and leading the country.
This is America Talks Live, Hour 2, where our most important program content comes from you. Your comments, questions, and observations called into us at 1-877-639-7629. That's 1-877-Newsmax. Now, you've heard of Throwback Thursdays, but this was Transition Thursday at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. President Obama welcoming President-elect Trump to the White House. And we just saw and heard yet another lecture from our current commander-in-chief, although he offered a generous dose of diplomacy in his little talk yesterday about post-election conduct. And what a stark contrast. So often he was blaming George W. Bush, but yesterday gave him credit. We will talk in depth about the Trump transition right after Miranda Kahn updates us on the latest headlines. Miranda?
Yeah, thanks, JD. Donald Trump, as you saw, met with President Obama at the White House today to discuss the transition between the two administrations. Obama told his team to make the transition seamless despite their political differences. Chairman of Trump's transition team, Chris Christie, says, don't expect the birther controversy to come up during this meeting.
What these two men recognize is that now this is about governing and leading the nation and the world. And they have a lot more important things to talk about.
Trump has since said that President Obama was born in the U.S. after questioning it back in 2011. Meanwhile, President Obama hasn't ruled out pardoning Hillary Clinton, which Trump surrogate Rudy Giuliani says shouldn't happen.
On the other hand, there are deep and disturbing issues there in which, if you don't investigate them, they're going to continue.
Giuliani also says that the alleged fraud at the Clinton Foundation hasn't been properly investigated yet. The Justice Department has shut down the investigation into the Clinton Foundation due to not having sufficient evidence. For much more on these stories, please visit Newsmax.com. I'm Miranda Kahn. Back to you, JD.
Thanks very much, Miranda. As we transition here, the topic, of course, is the transition of power. Lots of work to be done between now and January 20th, when Donald John Trump will be sworn in as the 45th President of the United States. And joining me here on the anchor desk to talk about how we get from here to there is former Ambassador Nancy Brinker, the host of Conversations with Nancy Brinker that you see here on Newsmax TV. And Ambassador Brinker did her time in diplomacy as the ambassador to the Republic of Hungary. Now, on the far side of the table from me, and perhaps fitting, at least from my vantage point, to the far right, my ideological compatriot and old friend Glen Downs, former Chief of Staff to the Conscience of Congress, Walter B. Jones Jr. of North Carolina. So, Nancy, you were named to a post by a president, and the whole transition that goes on, it's almost like there is a checklist where people have to work furiously. This meeting today, really big symbolically of the peaceful transition of power. Do you believe anything substantive is actually being discussed at the White House?
I think if they do it right, it will be. I know when we transitioned President Bush to President Obama, I was chief of protocol then, and President Bush asked us to prepare very large briefing booklets, which we did, describing, for example, in protocol, the nature of the visit, anything that our predecessor needed to know. And so when you say substantively, a lot of our form is substance in the White House or in a transition of government. It really is.
Well, it is worth noting that courtesy of our Constitution, our president is chief executive and also ceremonial head of state. And protocol should not be looked at in the pejorative. It is very important in terms of the business of government and the etiquette between and among nation states. But Glen Downs, I'm kind of wondering about the etiquette between these two leaders. The campaign was pretty tough. President Obama last week was at his demagogic worst as the denizen of the left. Can Mr. Obama turn on the charm for a guy who is not easily charmed today?
Well, obviously, everybody seems to be trying to lower the heat a little bit here, just in terms of their rhetoric. So it wouldn't surprise me if that continues on through this. Also, as you know, JD, there's a procedure that's set up well in advance of the actual election, where there's a transition offices are set up for the both major party nominees. So people have been doing transition things sort of leading up to this nuts and bolts sorts of things. But my concern is not what's going on in the transition office, but what's going on in places like the Justice Department right now. You know, there are a lot of people that might be, when you have an attorney general that's taking the Fifth Amendment on, for example, shipping pallets of cash to Iran, you know, who's taking care of what files and what evidence there in the Justice Department, for example, right now.
Yeah, speaking of protocol, in the old days, you'd have a document burn. In the new days, I guess it's the acid wash, Nancy, on computer records. And sadly, I don't put it past Loretta Lynch, as current Attorney General. She doesn't seem to be very interested in upholding the law.
It's very, very important that people, that we select people in these roles in our government who are, honest, transparent, and understand that the only thing that really matters when you're serving is that you are serving our country and you are loyal to the Constitution and to the citizens of our country, really, and that country first.
And mindful of that, in the hours following the election of Mr. Trump, some folks we had not heard from, and one who actually, as a former Republican president, voted for Hillary. George H.W. Bush and then George W. Bush both phoned the president-elect to congratulate him on his victory. Jeb Bush, who ran for the nomination, even offered this tweet very publicly that I think we'll put up on the screen here. Congratulations on your victory, Donald Trump. As our president, Columba and I will pray for you in the days and months to come. Ambassador, you know the diplomatic corps, you know protocol. Is it conceivable that former Governor Jeb Bush could have a role, I don't know, perhaps as ambassador to Mexico under the new president?
I hope and pray that he has a role. Other key leaders in our party who have a lot to say and a lot of experience have roles. And I think President-elect Trump, in his promise was to the American public to find the best talent. And the best talent often includes people who've done good jobs and who are competent, in this case, not just politicians, but statesmen and stateswomen.
Glen Downs, we've just come through a campaign. I believe the slogan is forgive and forget. And one school of thought says you could take a guy like Jeb, given his obvious affinity for Mexican culture and the way of life, and he might succeed diplomatically. But then there's always a concern, would he presume to undercut the policy of the man and the administration for whom he would work?
Well, that's the question. It's the $64,000 question. You've seen with Mr. Trump, and over the course of the primary campaign, people he had some pretty tough words with and sharp elbows with in these debates and other parts of the primary process, ended up coming on board with him, people like Dr. Ben Carson and others, and are key parts of his team. So it wouldn't be unprecedented, but at the end of the day, part of the reason I'm convinced those guys came on board where it was because they acknowledged or made it clear they acknowledged that Mr. Trump was the nominee, not them. And now Mr. Trump is the president and not them. And it's his policies, not their policies, that they would have to be following.
Well, it's interesting to take a look, and you mentioned the reconciliation. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention even John Kasich apparently sat down with his staff, and they finally said, hey, Governor, you got to get with the program. Mr. Trump is our president. So it even appears that John Kasich is in the midst of a reconciliation among Republicans. Our good friend John Gizzi, our chief Washington correspondent, decided to put out some names early for a possible Trump cabinet. I think we have them to put up on the screen. Some of the names being mentioned: Newt Gingrich for Secretary of State, retired Lieutenant General Mike Flynn at Defense, Rudy Giuliani as AG, Jeff Sessions as Secretary of Homeland Security, Ben Carson as Secretary of Education. Nancy, you know that one of the great games in Washington is to somehow become the great mentioner.
Right.
Our friend John Gizzi is a good listener and a pretty good guy picking up on things. Do you believe that early list, will we see any of those names in those positions?
Probably a pretty good chance. I sure would hope. There are two people I'm very fond of for their skills. One is Governor Rick Scott. He should play a role I mean, he's done a wonderful job as governor of Florida fixing some very difficult issues. And my good friend, who lost by a thread, Senator Kelly Ayotte, who is loved, not just among women, but for her skills in defense, armed services, and many, many other things.
Well, she may have to be special liaison to John McCain and Lindsey Graham because we know their penchant, Glenn, for always running to the press corps as, we're the different Republicans. We're going to get outside the box. And I'm sorry to say, I think we're still going to see that kind of attitude from a newly reelected Senator McCain.
Probably so, at least to some extent. And unfortunately, Senator Ayotte ended up distancing herself from Mr. Trump, which probably in the end cost her those few thousand votes in that election in New Hampshire. But at the end of the day, I suspect in Congress, on the very front end of this, there's going to, because it's in their mutual self-interest, I expect the Paul Ryan and the Republican senators to find some common ground with Mr. Trump and get some things passed pretty quickly.
For what it's worth, one of my favorite four-letter words, Newt Gingrich was on Fox News Radio yesterday. Despite all the talk about Secretary of State, the former speaker says there's another position in which he has an interest. Let's listen.
I'd like to be the chief planner. I mean, I'd like to look at how do you transform the Veterans Administration? How do you profoundly improve our approach to national security? What do you have to do to have a long-term health system that is actually better, more convenient, more productive, and less expensive?
So Newt wants to be the chief planner. Forgive me, Glenn, it almost sounds like Seward's letter to Lincoln. To have that kind of expansive portfolio, about 15 seconds.
Well, you said this, something like this would not be entirely unprecedented. The way the cabinet system is set up today is different than the way it was back in Lincoln's day, and the weight that cabinet secretaries have. So maybe something different here.
Well, it's decidedly different to have the incisive analysis of Ambassador Brinker and our good friend Glen Downs. Your calls are next as we continue here on America Talks Live for this Transition Thursday.